Emily Carter wasn't just another detective in Willow Creek. She was the one who walked straight into the shadows the city feared, tracking Victor Hale, a quiet courthouse janitor whose red ribbon marked the end for every woman he hunted. Until the night she turned his ritual into his downfall, in Willow Creek, a small city known for its quiet neighborhoods and tree-lined streets. Peace had been broken in the most brutal way imaginable. Over the past 8 months, the bodies of young women had been turning up in abandoned industrial areas, each discovery more horrifying than the last. The victims were always found alone, their lifeless forms arranged as though someone had taken great care in placing them. And always, without fail, there was the same chilling detail: a red ribbon tied tightly around the right wrist. It was a signature so distinct that even those who avoided the news knew about it. The murders had left the community in a state of constant unease, as if danger lurked behind every corner. The police department had thrown nearly all its resources into the investigation, but the killer seemed to stay one step ahead at every turn. There were no fingerprints, no DNA traces, and no witnesses willing to come forward. The streets emptied earlier each night, and mothers walked their daughters to school with a wary eye on anyone who passed too close. News reporters called the perpetrator the ribbon killer, and their stories painted a picture of someone methodical, someone who enjoyed the fear he was spreading as much as the crimes themselves. The mayor faced growing public outrage, and the police chief's voice grew heavier at every press briefing. The killer was mocking them, leaving behind bodies in places that seemed impossible to patrol effectively. Despite the lack of hard evidence, there was a shared belief within the department that the person responsible was watching them, reading the news, studying the police response, and moving like a shadow through the city. It was in the midst of this frustration that Detective Emily Carter was assigned to lead the case. Emily was no stranger to high-pressure investigations. Known for her sharp instincts and relentless pursuit of the truth, she had solved cases others considered unsolvable. Her colleagues described her as methodical, patient, and willing to notice details others overlooked. She read the case files from beginning to end, studying every photograph and autopsy report, sometimes working until the early hours of the morning. What struck her was not just what was present in the evidence, but what was missing. The crime scenes were always isolated yet connected in a way that felt intentional. Each location was chosen with care, as if the killer knew how to lure his victims there without causing a scene. Emily began laying out city maps in her office, marking each site with red pins. When she stepped back to look at the pattern, something stood out. The sites curved around the outskirts of the city like a tightening loop, as though the killer was gradually working his way toward the center. The realization unsettled her. If the pattern held true, his next target could be in one of the busiest parts of Willow Creek. She began visiting each location in person, retracing the paths the victims might have taken. She studied the surrounding streets, the potential escape routes, and the vantage points where someone could have waited unseen. At the third site, an abandoned lot near an old textile mill, she noticed a broken street lamp. It had been out for months according to the utility records, creating a perfect pocket of darkness at the exact place the body was found. To Emily, it didn't feel like coincidence. It felt like planning. Back at the station, she reviewed the personal histories of the victims, searching for a link beyond their age and appearance. Though they lived in different neighborhoods, most of them had routines that kept them out late or in quiet areas alone. It was the kind of pattern that would only be known to someone who had observed them for days, maybe weeks, before striking. The thought of the killer studying his prey so closely gnawed at her. She kept her theories to herself for now, unwilling to risk tipping off the wrong person, even inside her own department. Trust was fragile in cases like this, and she had learned from experience that the fewer people who knew the full scope of an investigation, the better the chances of catching the suspect off guard. Emily felt a strange mix of dread and determination. Somewhere in the city, the person responsible was living a seemingly ordinary life, blending into the crowd. He might be a neighbor, a shopkeeper, or the man walking his dog past the station. But she knew one thing with certainty. Whoever he was confident. Too confident. And that confidence could be the thread she needed to pull until the entire case unraveled. The hunt for the ribbon killer had already claimed too many lives, but Emily was determined that it would not take another. She decided then that she would have to step outside the usual investigative path. If the killer was watching them, she would make sure he saw exactly what she wanted him to see, until it was too late for him to escape. Emily's investigation moved into a new phase as she began cross-referencing the crime scenes with detailed maps of Willow Creek. She wasn't just looking for the next likely location. She was trying to understand the mind behind the murders. The curved pattern she had noticed earlier became even more distinct when she overlaid it with the city's transport routes, alley networks, and the location of public security cameras. The killer had managed to commit each crime just beyond the reach of surveillance, as though he had memorized the blind spots of the city. It was the work of someone who understood the layout intimately, perhaps from years of living or working. Within it, she started breaking down the timeline between each murder. The gaps varied, sometimes 2 weeks, sometimes a month, but there was always enough time for the public to grow a little less tense before the next attack reignited fear. The spacing felt deliberate, a calculated rhythm meant to keep the police off balance. Emily suspected the killer was choosing his moments carefully, waiting for opportunities when his intended victims would be at their most vulnerable to get closer. She revisited each scene herself. She didn't just walk the area, she immersed herself in it. She noted the way the light fell at different hours, the sound of traffic from nearby streets, and the places where a person could hide in plain sight. It was during one of these visits, at the site of the fourth murder, that she noticed something odd. Faint tire marks pressed into the dirt near the edge of the location. They were nearly invisible under a thin layer of dust, but the angle suggested the vehicle had backed in, likely to avoid being seen from the road. The tracks led toward an old railway bridge that had long since fallen into disrepair. The bridge was overgrown with weeds and graffiti, but beyond it lay a cluster of warehouses, relics of a once thriving manufacturing district. Most had been abandoned for years, but some still carried faint signs of recent activity. Emily pushed open the rusted door of one warehouse and stepped inside. Dust clung to the air, and her footsteps echoed against the metal walls. In one corner, she spotted remnants that didn't belong. Waxy patches melted into the concrete, the faint scent of perfume, and a small, crumpled piece of red ribbon no longer than her finger. The discovery sent a rush of certainty through her. This wasn't just where the killer brought his victims. This was where he prepared. The candles could be part of the ritual she suspected, and the perfume hinted that he had taken items from his victims as trophies. She didn't disturb anything. Instead, she quietly slipped out, marking the location mentally. This was a place she could use. If the killer had returned here before, there was a chance he would again. Emily made the decision to keep this lead entirely to herself. She knew that if too many people became aware of the warehouse, it could spook the killer into changing his habits. She didn't want him to know the police were closing in. Her plan was to make the site a silent trap. If she could anticipate his movements and place surveillance in the right spots, she might finally catch him in the act. She returned a few nights later with portable surveillance cameras, placing them in concealed positions inside and outside the warehouse. She angled them to cover the entrance, the corners where the candles had been, and the space where the ribbon fragment had been found. The cameras were equipped with infrared lenses, able to pick up movement in complete darkness. She also concealed a small audio recorder in a loose panel near the wall, hoping to capture any sound he might make. The first nights brought nothing more than the occasional shadow of a stray cat or the flutter of birds startled from the rafters. But Emily didn't lose patience. She knew that in cases like this, waiting was just as important as chasing leads. She spent each night in a surveillance van parked several blocks away, watching the live feeds, listening to the faint hum of the equipment, and studying the killer's possible return routes. Outside, the city carried on with its tense normalcy. People hurried through their errands, glancing over their shoulders more often than before. Posters with the victims' faces still clung to telephone poles, their colors faded from sun and rain. Every new lead the police announced seemed to fizzle into nothing, but Emily was certain this warehouse could be the turning point. She had seen enough in her career to know that killers with patterns rarely abandon them entirely. If this place had meaning to him once, it would again. The challenge was to be ready when he came back, not a second too soon, not a second too late. Somewhere out there, the ribbon killer was planning his next move, and Emily was quietly preparing to end his rhythm for good. 5 nights passed before anything shifted. Emily sat in the surveillance van, her eyes fixed on the dim, grainy feed from the cameras inside the warehouse. The hours had been long and uneventful, broken only by the occasional flicker of movement from insects passing too close to the lens. Just after midnight, the screen changed. A shadow appeared at the far edge of the frame, tall and deliberate in its movements. The figure paused at the warehouse door, scanning the surroundings as though listening for the faintest sound. Then, with a slow push, the door creaked open, and he slipped inside. Emily's pulse quickened, but her breathing remained steady. She watched as the figure set down a small bag, removing its contents one by one. First came a series of short, white candles, each placed in a precise circle on the floor. Next was a roll of red ribbon, unspooled carefully and laid in the center. Of the candles, the man moved methodically, his motions almost rehearsed, as if this was part of a deeply ingrained ritual. The cameras caught enough detail to reveal more: black gloves, a dark jacket, and a cap pulled low to hide his features. His face never turned toward the lenses, but Emily could sense the control in his posture, the confidence of someone who believed no one was watching. He lit 2 of the candles, letting the flames flicker in the darkness. The glow cast long, shifting shadows that gave the entire scene an eerie stillness. Emily leaned forward in her seat, absorbing every movement. She realized this was more than preparation. It was a form of rehearsal. He wasn't killing tonight. He was planning, refining the details for when it mattered. She imagined him practicing this same sequence before each murder, the ribbon, as a final, unchanging mark of ownership over his victims. After several minutes, he blew out the candles, carefully returning each item to the bag. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small scrap of paper, which he folded and slipped under one of the unlit candles. It was a deliberate act, and Emily knew it could be a clue. She let him leave without interference, not wanting to spook him before she understood his full pattern. Once the warehouse was empty, she moved in with gloves and a flashlight. The scrap of paper was still there. Unfolding it, she found a list of addresses, each handwritten in neat block letters. Some of the addresses were already familiar. They matched the homes of previous victims. But 2 of them were new. A chill ran down her spine as she realized what it meant. He had already chosen his next targets. The next step was tracing the paper's source. Emily photographed it for evidence and had the handwriting analyzed. The style was neat, almost too precise. With no signs of hesitation, analysts suggested it might belong to someone accustomed to filling out forms or logging detailed records, perhaps someone in a clerical job or a role that demanded careful documentation. The clue tightened her focus. She began looking into professions near the center of the map's curve, jobs that offered both anonymity and access to public information. This was when the possibility of someone connected to the courthouse crossed her mind. It was a place central enough to link many of the mapped locations, and its staff often had access to records that could reveal where people lived. While she worked on this angle, Emily kept the warehouse under surveillance. For 3 nights after his visit, nothing happened. Then, on the 4th night, a new development emerged. A different camera, the one mounted outside, facing the alley, picked up the same figure passing by, but this time he didn't go inside. Instead, he seemed to be watching, as if making sure the space hadn't been disturbed. He lingered for a few minutes before disappearing into the shadows. The behavior confirmed something for Emily. He was cautious but still attached to the warehouse. Even if he suspected it had been compromised, he couldn't abandon it completely. That attachment could be used against him. She started working on a plan to combine surveillance with a mobile tail, ready to follow him if he led her to his next intended victim. The city outside remained unaware of how close the investigation had come to identifying the ribbon killer. The public only knew that another body had not yet been found, and the uneasy relief made people loosen their guard. Emily didn't share that relief. She knew this was simply the quiet before the next storm. And now, with his ritual revealed, and his future victims partially known, she was more certain than ever that the window to stop him was closing fast. Tracing the handwritten list from the warehouse, Emily began focusing her search on the 2 unfamiliar addresses. She pulled property, records, utility data, and recent changes in residency. looking for any common thread. Both addresses belonged to single women in their late 20s, living alone in quiet neighborhoods. Neither had prior police reports, and their daily lives seemed ordinary at first glance. But when Emily checked public surveillance and traffic cameras, she noticed something unsettling. A dark sedan, the same make and model, appeared near both homes within days of each other, always parked just far enough away to avoid suspicion. She dug deeper into registered vehicles matching that description and found one linked to a man named Victor Hale. The name meant nothing to her at first, but when she ran his employment records, the pieces began to align. Victor worked as a janitor at the Willow Creek Courthouse, a building located at the very center of the pattern Emily had traced on her map. His position gave him unrestricted movement through offices, hallways, and file storage rooms. It also meant he could overhear conversations, see court documents, and pick up information about people without drawing attention. Victor's personnel file painted a picture of someone unremarkable: no disciplinary actions, steady employment, and a quiet demeanor. But the more Emily studied him, the more convinced she became that the ordinary facade was intentional. She began discreet surveillance, following him after work hours. Most evenings were uneventful. He would leave the courthouse, stop by a diner at the same time every night, and then drive straight to his small apartment on the city's west side. It was on the third night of surveillance that his routine changed. Victor skipped the diner and drove instead to a park on the edge of town. He parked in the far corner of the lot, where streetlights didn't reach, and remained there for nearly an hour. Through her binoculars, Emily could see that he wasn't simply sitting idly. He was watching. A young woman jogged laps along the park's path, her route bringing her into view every few minutes. Victor's posture remained still, but his gaze followed her each time she passed. When the jogger left, he started his car and followed her at a measured distance. Emily kept several vehicles between them, not wanting to alert him. The streets grew quieter as they moved into residential areas, the glow of streetlights flickering past. Victor's driving was calm, almost casual, but every turn matched the jogger's route. Emily's grip tightened on the steering wheel as she called in his movements to her small team. Traffic worked against her. A late-night delivery truck slowed the backup units, leaving Emily as the only one close enough to keep him in sight. The jogger eventually turned down a narrow side street, likely a shortcut to her home. Victor followed, his headlights dimmed. Emily stayed far enough back to remain invisible, but close enough to act if necessary. The street ended in a quiet residential block, lined with older buildings and few working street lamps. The jogger stopped near a side entrance, reaching for her keys. Victor pulled into the shadows of an alley just across from her building. Emily could see him leaning forward, watching her with stillness that radiated intent. Her instincts told her this was no coincidence. Victor wasn't scouting anymore. This was the moment before he acted. She made the decision not to wait for backup. If she hesitated, the young woman might vanish into the long list of victims whose lives ended with a red ribbon around their wrist. Emily stepped out of her car, her movements silent. Every muscle in her body was tense, focused on the alley where Victor's car sat. The sound of the jogger's door closing echoed faintly in the night. In that instant, Victor emerged from the vehicle. Even in the shadows, Emily could see the glint of something in his hand. The ribbon was there, neatly coiled, ready for its purpose. The distance between them was shrinking, and Emily knew she had seconds to make her move. Every detail she had gathered, every late night in the warehouse, every address on that list, had led to this point. The hunt was almost over, but the final step would have to be taken with precision. If Victor slipped away now, the cycle would continue, and her months of careful pursuit would be for nothing. Victor's steps were slow, calculated, the kind of measured movement that came from absolute control. The coiled red ribbon in his hand caught the faint glow of a distant street lamp, a thin slash of color against the dark. The jogger, still unaware of his presence, was unlocking the side entrance to her apartment building. Emily moved in, her footsteps deliberate, keeping her focus solely on Victor. Every nerve in her body told her there was no room for hesitation. Closing the distance, she timed her approach to his own rhythm. The moment he reached the edge of the sidewalk, she accelerated, closing the gap in a swift, silent burst. Her arm locked around him in one motion, and the surprise threw him off balance. The ribbon slipped from his grasp, fluttering to the pavement. Emily forced him against the wall, controlling his weight with practiced precision, preventing him from recovering. He thrashed once, twice, before realizing resistance was pointless. By then, she already had him pinned. The jogger froze in shock, eyes darting between them. Emily gave her a quick nod towards safety, and the young woman hurried inside without looking back. In the distance, the wail of sirens began to grow, her backup finally breaking through the slowed traffic. By the time they arrived, Victor was restrained, his composure gone, replaced with a blank stare that revealed nothing. He didn't speak, didn't ask questions, and didn't protest the arrest. The search of his apartment began within hours. What Emily and her team found inside confirmed every suspicion she'd held. One wall was covered entirely in photographs of women, most taken from a distance without their knowledge. Each image was marked with a strip of red ribbon, some curling. At the edges, others crisp and new. Beneath each photograph was a handwritten note, detailing routines, addresses, and even the times when the women were most likely to be alone. Several faces on the wall were victims already known to the case, but others were unfamiliar. Women who had never realized they were being hunted. Boxes under his bed held items Emily recognized from evidence reports, a scarf missing from one victim, a broken bracelet from another. There were also new trophies, ones without matching case files, suggesting there were crimes they had yet to uncover. Most disturbing of all was a notebook on his desk, its pages filled with lists and dates. Some were crossed out, others still pending. At the very top of the last page were the two addresses from the scrap of paper in the warehouse, written neatly, as if part of a to-do list. The evidence left no doubt about his identity as the ribbon killer. Yet, even with the proof surrounding him, Victor remained expressionless during questioning. He didn't admit guilt, didn't defend himself, and never acknowledged the photographs. It was as if the capture had stripped him of purpose, and without the hunt, there was nothing left to say. The case broke wide open in the media. Headlines filled every news broadcast, recounting the months of fear that had gripped Willow Creek, and the final moments when Detective Emily Carter had stopped the killer in the act. Citizens who had avoided the streets after dark began to move freely again, though caution lingered in their eyes. The red ribbon, once a sign of dread, became a symbol of justice in the city's memory. For Emily, the end of the case brought no celebration. The relief was quiet, tempered by the knowledge of how close the killer had come to claiming another life. The photographs on Victor's wall haunted her, the faces of women who had no idea they had been marked. Some of them still lived in the city, and the thought of how narrowly they had escaped tightened her chest. In the weeks that followed, the evidence was processed, court proceedings began, and the public's attention shifted toward the trial. Emily, however, continued to visit the warehouse before it was eventually demolished. Standing in its hollow, echoing interior, she thought about how something so ordinary had been the center of so much darkness. The wax marks, the scent of perfume, the coiled ribbon, all were gone, but the image of that night's footage remained burned into her memory. Willow Creek slowly returned to its quiet rhythm, but Emily knew the scars of the case would not fade quickly. People spoke her name with gratitude, yet she avoided the spotlight. For her, the work was never about recognition. It was about ending the cycle before it took another life. And in this case, the cycle had ended on a dark street, with a single decisive act and a ribbon left harmless on the ground.